let's go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. This is our second in an inspirational series, and we are delighted to have Don Stanford with us today. I'll have Dennis Littky introduce him officially in just a few minutes. I'm very excited because Don and I both come from the same company, which is IGT. I've been there for about 1.5 years, and I'll speak more about that in just a little bit. What I would ask everyone to do is if you have questions, you may type them in the chat. If you have any technical concerns, first and foremost, it usually is Wi-Fi and a Wi-Fi connection, so you might just want to check that. And if you're having trouble, you may want to try stepping out and stepping back into the room. I will be monitoring the chat today, as well as our technical guru, who is Brian Mills. So if you have any technical questions beyond that, you can always send a private chat to Brian, but we'll also be monitoring the chat for other questions. I'm acting as your moderator today and as your producer. So I will have an opportunity to chat with Don and ask some questions, and you'll also have that opportunity as well. So without further ado, I would like to introduce my friend and colleague, Dennis Littky, who I've had the pleasure of knowing for a little less than 1 year, and who certainly helps keep things interesting with the work that we're doing with College Unbound and educating adults. So with that, Dennis, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Michelle. Notice I have my letter jacket on with my name. We don't have sports, but I like a letter jacket, so I'm the only one that has one. So welcome, everybody. I'm president of College Unbound, which is a college for adults returning to school. The great news is that we are online and offline. So when the pandemic hit, we were able to move off our being in person to online, and in the fall, we'll be ready to go back and forth depending on what the situation is in our state. And the cool part is that you can go full-time to College Unbound while you work full-time. So you can be getting that 24 and 30 credits while you're working. But then in the summer, you know, the headlines of the paper today, people being furloughed. I know people are being unemployed. So College Unbound is offering a free course to every Rhode Islander. And it's our give back to the state to help people. So if you have a little time, there's a creative writing course, there's a meditation course, there's Michelle's working on a course with Julie Dabari on the success in the new normal. So come on and sign on for a course and see what it's like. And now I'll move to my friend Don Stanford. I met him at BIF many, many years ago, and we got to know each other a bit. And then the next year we said, you know, we didn't get together. Let's get together. And then the next year at BIF we said, you know, let's get together. We haven't got together. So I solved that problem by bringing him on the show. So not only are Don and I getting together finally, but sharing him with everybody. So he is one of our local icons. One of the founders of GTECH that now turned to IGT. And when Don was there, it had 5% of the market and it went to 70% of the market. It was $1 million business that went to $1 billion business. So pretty amazing work that he did along with his colleagues. And then he tried to retire. And I use the word tried because he failed at that. And they asked him to come back and fix some things up just for 18 months. Well, 10 years later, he retired again. And so I wore my special shoes and socks. These are my lemon shoes and socks because Don's the perfect example of taking lemon when there's a problem and turning it into lemonade. So thank you, Don. He has won the Black Engineer of the Year Award, and at the same time won the Thurgood Marshall Community Award. So pretty amazing. And then 2 weeks ago, we won the Entrepreneur of the Year Award at Brown University. So he's been a pretty amazing guy that just keeps learning, keeps growing. He will be teaching for College Unbound. So as I turn it over to him, I wore a shirt that really describes him. He has great passion. He continues to grow. And as an engineer, no bull. Don and Michelle.
And I have had the opportunity, so in Rhode Island, everything is 1 degree of separation, or as Don says, 0.5 degrees of separation. And Dennis happened to know Don and want to connect him with this work. And I happened to work at IGT. Unfortunately for me, when I got to IGT, Don was getting ready to retire. But I've had an opportunity to really watch from afar. You know, as I'm a new employee and I'm standing up and Don's giving his retirement speech, I was just in awe of the story. So I had an opportunity to hear that. And then through prepping for this, this session, I had an opportunity to get to know Don. And I am incredibly inspired, as I know you will be after our chat today. And as I see some of my IGT colleagues on here, I know that they are here because they are inspired as well. And so with that, I welcome you, Don, to our College Unbound talk. And I'll start by asking a series of questions. And then, like I said, anybody who has questions can type them in the chat, and then you can always unmute and talk directly with Don. So as we're following up on the Daniel Pink conversation, Don and my conversation earlier in the week or last week is very close to some of those concepts, but from a different perspective. So Don, I'm going to ask the first question, which is, can you tell the group about your background, career pivots, and transitions? Because I was fascinated by those.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Dennis. Thank you, Michelle. Great to be here at College Unbound. I see a few of my peeps, Jay Buckley, Steve Mooney, Kim Lee. I see a whole bunch of my former IGT colleagues on the line here. This is great. So just let me give you a little background. I grew up in the Virgin Islands on the island of St. Thomas. Some of you may have gone through there on a cruise ship or on a vacation. Back in the 1950s, we had no TV station. We had a single radio station. So basically I grew up listening to the radio and reading books. My parents were very focused on my brothers and my education, and they had people up in the States sending us books all the time. So I had plenty to read, which basically kept me intellectually engaged. I got my first subscription to National Geographic, I think, when I was 7 or 8 years old. So I was able to read about the world outside of this little island I was living on. And I got a very early interest in science. When I was 8 years old, I got a microscope set from Gilbert Scientific, which was a company that made science kits for kids in those days. And I turned on it, I set up this microscope and I started looking at bugs. One thing we had plenty of in the Virgin Islands was bugs. And so I was fascinated by exploring things through this microscope. And so I got a really early interest in science. By the way, I still have that microscope set in pristine condition, and I'm going to give it to my grandson, who will turn 8 this October. So I'm going to pass this set down to him and show him how to use it also in about 6 months. Anyway, I had this early interest in science. I got chemistry sets. We have a lot of clear sky down there, so I was always looking at things in the sky with binoculars. And so I had this passion early on for anything that was scientific, and I was a voracious reader. And that kind of set the stage for other things that happened in my life. When I was 14, I met a fellow named Dick Spenceley, who owned the appliance business in St. Thomas, and he was a ham radio operator. In fact, he was one of the most well-known ham radio operators in the entire world. He'd been on the air since 1927, and he basically had talked to everyone there was anyone around the planet from his radio station. And I got a chance to go in and see this radio station of his, and I immediately was blown away by this whole concept of shortwave radio and electronics. So I started studying that on my own, and he was my mentor. And eventually he issued the license exam to me that I passed, and I became a licensed ham radio operator when I was 14 years old. So that set the stage for a whole bunch of other things because I was passionate about the radio. It was all self-study. I wasn't studying any of it in school. But again, it set the stage for things further down the line. Educationally, I went to school in St. Thomas. Then I went to school for a couple of years in Puerto Rico, to a boys' school in Puerto Rico. I went to school in Europe for 2 years, and I finished high school in Washington, D.C., right before coming to college. And I ended up coming to Brown University because the woman that I babysat for in Washington, D.C. had gone to Brown. She was a physician, and she basically talked me into not only applying to Brown, but to going to Brown, coming to Brown when I was accepted, even though I had had my heart set on going to Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. So I changed course, ended up coming to Providence in the fall of 1968, 52 years ago. And that's how I actually landed on these shores. And I have been here ever since. And although I still have my roots in St. Thomas and I have my home there, I have a home there, a family home, I have been in Rhode Island since 1968, continuously practically. So along the way, I continued to study electronics. When I was working at Brown as a student, I was the electronics technician in the language laboratory, fixing all the equipment there for 4 years. Great job, paid $2.75 an hour. I kept my own hours and continued to grow and learn. But I didn't study engineering at Brown, although I took some engineering courses, and I took a couple of courses in applied mathematics, which was, in those days, computer science. My concentration was in international relations, which was a major that combined economics, political science, in history. When I graduated in '72, on time, I immediately got a job as an electronics technician, fixing electronic equipment because of my background in radio. And so I studied, self-studied digital electronics, which I, at that time, didn't know much about, and got a job with a service company servicing mini computers, the first generation of small business computers, which was a booming business. Not only were they selling like hotcakes, but they weren't very reliable. So the service company I worked for had plenty of business fixing them. And I decided to go to law school. And so my day in 1973, after I graduated, was I got up at 6 a.m. I lived in Providence, would get on the road and have my first service call at 7 in the morning and drive around the perimeter of Boston on Route 128 there, going from one place to the other. And every evening I would drive into Newbury Street in Boston and I'd go to law school. And law school started at 6 p.m. and I got out around 11 and got back to Providence around midnight and would do that whole thing all over again. And I did that for an entire year, 1973, 74. And at the end of the year, I was exhausted. I was unhappy. I was exhausted. I wasn't at all happy with my life. I was, had no free time. And I came to a decision point in my life, my first major decision point. And I had to make a decision. I said, I'm either going to focus on law school or I'm going to focus on technology, even though I don't have a technology degree, but I have plenty of hands-on training. And I made the final decision to drop out of law school. And a major life-changing decision. First of all, I didn't like law school, and I didn't even like law because it was all gray. There was no yes or no, there was no right or wrong. It was all gray, which some people thrive in. Meanwhile, I'm fixing computers that were binary. Yes, no, true and false. And so I opted for the technology route. The problem is I didn't have a technology degree. I just had all of this self-study and this hands-on education. But I found a headhunter who got me into Raytheon down in Portsmouth, Rhode Island, where they were desperate for anyone that had ever touched a mini computer. And I got hired as the most junior level engineer that they had on the payroll. And Raytheon became my technology school. And I was mentored there by several great people over the next 5 years. And I effectively became an engineer through, again, on-the-job training and practice. And so that was wonderful. While I was there, I also enrolled back at Brown in the master's program in computer science and did that half-time while I was working full-time. By this time I was married but had no kids. And it was a grueling schedule. I used to go into work at 4 a.m. in the morning, leave around 1 p.m. and then go to school till late in the evening, writing software, getting it to trying to get it to run on the mainframe computer that everyone used at Brown back in those days. But I loved it. The difference was I was now happy with what I was doing. I was learning something every day, both at work and at school, and I was having a great time. I got the master's degree in '77, and in 1979, I answered an ad in the Boston Globe for a software manager for a small gaming company located in downtown Providence. And I went down to 101 Dyer Street above Capriccio Restaurant. I went up to the second floor there, and I met a fellow named Peter Fallis in an office that was about 1,500 square feet. And he described this software business that they were in, developing software for the newly emerging state lottery industry that was just then really starting to take off. And I then interviewed with a guy named Victor Markowitz, who was the co-founder of this little gaming group. It was called Gaming Dimensions at that time. And something really interesting happened. He looked at my resume and he saw that I had gone to Brown. And he said, do you know a fellow named, I think it was named, he said, do you know this guy from Brown that was a close friend of his? And I said, well, yeah, I do remember him. When I was an undergraduate in the language laboratory, he was a linguistics PhD student, and he had asked me to build some experiments for him, which I did because I had an electronics lab there, and I was able to build things. And so I just kind of did these things as a favor to him. Well, it turns out they were best friends. That night he called his friend who said, oh, Don Stanford, I remember him from 10 years ago at Brown. Absolutely, hire him. And that's how I got the job. Life lesson there was you never know when someone from your past is going to make a big difference in your future. And another way to say that, I think, is never burn a bridge behind you. When you go from one thing to the other, you transition, whether it's employer, career, whatever it may be, always try to leave with a level of mutual respect and understanding, because you never know when someone from your past is going to show up and make a difference in your future, especially in Rhode Island, where we have about a half a degree of separation. So I went to work with this little startup company. At that time, I was the 8th employee. And 3 weeks after I started, a guy showed up from the company that was then called Narragansett Electric to turn off the power, because we were 2.5, 3 months late on paying the power bill. And we, meanwhile, we're writing feverishly. We're working on software for the Connecticut lottery, which we had a contract that we had just won, and we're under the gun to deliver. And we knew if they turned off the power, it would be weeks before we get the power back, and we would be dead in the water. So we took a collection in the office and raised, I don't know, $687 or something like that to pay the guy to leave, okay, without turning off the power. And I went home that night to my wife and I said, you know, I left this kind of uninteresting job at a huge successful company at Raytheon to go work for this little startup. And I really love what's going on at this startup, but we can't pay the power bill. So I said, I don't know how much longer we're going to be in business. Well, okay, the rest is history. We did persevere. We did deliver that system to Connecticut on time, which made a big mark for us in the industry and kind of gave us some credentials and credibility to move forward. But again, the lesson learned there is, you know, especially in those trying times when we were under the gun and under a lot of pressure, everyone pulled together, and we managed to make things work. By the way, that software group that I was hired to manage, first of all, I'd never managed anyone before in my life, especially software engineers. And we had 4 people in the group, one of whom didn't speak a word of English, one of whom didn't speak to anyone at all for any reason whatsoever, and then one person who talked incessantly, and then one actually kind of normal person. Welcome to the world of software. Jay Buckley knows a few of these people. Anyway, but we pulled it off, and we delivered. After that, we responded to every RFP that came out, and they started to come out pretty quickly then. And we, over the next 5 years, won 70% of all of the bids in the lottery industry. We also expanded our footprint into Australia. We went to Australia, installed 2 systems on the other side of the world. And so now we were also an international company, strangely enough. And so things really took off for us. As we were successful, one job after the other, effectively, we became more credible than our 2 competitors, both of whom were divisions of large multinational corporations that just could not keep up with us. We decided to effectively change the platform that lotteries operated on, change the operating philosophy, and they decided to basically stick with an older solution. And effectively, over the next 5 years, we outmaneuvered the big guys and became the name brand in the online lottery business. It was an incredible period of growth. We were growing at 25% a year. We finally outgrew the facility in downtown Providence, and we had to move south into Warwick and then finally into West Greenwich.
Okay. I couldn't hear you for a second.
All set there?
Yeah, we're good.
Okay. And so the company grew at a phenomenal rate. We were very, very successful. One of the biggest pivotal moments for us was February 14th, 1986. That afternoon, Valentine's Day, it was a snowy, kind of overcast, cold day, and I got 2 phone calls. I was the most senior person in the office that day. Guy and Victor, the founders, were both traveling around the world someplace, and we got a call that we had won the New York lottery at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, we got word that we had won the California lottery. So we won the 2 largest lotteries in the country on the same day, February 14th. We closed the plant down in Warwick, and we had this blowout party at a bar in downtown Providence in the middle of a snowstorm. At 9 o'clock, the manager of the facility came to me and said they had to close the party down because they had to get people out of the building because it was snowing so hard. Plus, the party had gotten out of control anyway, and he had 75 fully filled out receipts that I had to sign to get out of the building. So that was a huge moment for us. Another huge moment was in 1994. We got word that we had our consortium that we had helped form, called Camelot, had won the UK national lottery contract, which was at that time going to be the largest lottery contract on the planet. So these were, big high points along the way, with many, many other high points in between. In 2002, I was exhausted. I had been around the world 20 times. I was tired. My oldest daughter was was going to college, and I decided I needed to step back. So at the beginning of 2002, I retired and started teaching computer science at Brown as a visiting professor, and decided to spend literally spend more time with my family and go into academia a little bit. And that was very satisfying for me. I also got to spend a lot more time at my home in St. Thomas. 6 years later, I was sitting in my swimming pool in St. Thomas at 4 o'clock in the afternoon at the beginning of August, and the phone rang, and it was the then CEO of GTECH, Jamin Patel, calling me to ask me if I would come back for about 18 months or so to deal with some technology issues and some organizational issues in technology. So I told him that I would had to freshen my drink and think about it. But yes, I decided to do that. And so on September 1st, 2008, I came back to the company after being retired for 6 years. And that 18 months turned into about a 10-year stint. And I was able to retire for the second time at the end of 2018. And since then, I've expanded my teaching at Brown. I now teach both undergraduates in a course called The Digital World, which is really computer science for everyone. And I also teach in the Executive Master's Program. I teach mid-career professionals in a course called Science and Technology Leadership, which is very satisfying. The whole idea of being at Brown and teaching and advising students is really, really intellectually satisfying because it allows me to go back to school myself and learn something new every day. I've been very involved with the Entrepreneurship Program at Brown, which is a really blossoming operation. And in fact, I am now an investor and an advisor to a company that has a student created company that is now raised over $3 million and is in full operation. So we're constantly involved with that group of students. And in fact, a former colleague of mine, Jamin Patel, who I mentioned earlier, he and I are both co-investors and advisors to this startup company. So here we are back in the startup business, albeit not working 18 hours a day like the founders are. So, so that's kind of where my journey has taken me. When I look back on this career, I think that there were a lot of crossroads along the way, and I kind of think what would have happened if I'd gone one way or the other. Dropping out of law school was certainly a momentous, but in retrospect, the correct decision. I spent a lot of time in my career with lawyers, discussing things of every conceivable nature. And every time I leave one of those meetings, I'm happy that I wasn't the lawyer, that I was really the technologist, talking to the lawyer. But the life lesson that I think I learned along the way was you have to do what you're passionate about. If you're not passionate about what you're doing, you're really probably not going to do the best job. And so it behooves you to find that spot where you feel really challenged and you feel that, in fact, you not only can make a contribution, but you can also continue to learn and become a lifelong learner dealing with whoever you're interacting with at that time. And so to me, that's important, is to be able to always do something every day where I can learn something new, interact with people who are passionate about what they want to do. And if I can help, try and do so and help make them successful also. I was always the beneficiary of great mentors, starting with that fellow, Dick Spenceley, when I got into ham radio. At Raytheon, I had great mentors who basically taught me engineering. I had great mentors at GTECH. I learned how to sell. I learned how to go out and represent the company around the world from a fellow named George Murray, who was effectively our chief salesman. And he was the person that taught me that before you can sell anything to anybody, the first thing you have to do is gain their trust. And that was as important as anything else when trying to promote your solution to a customer that isn't necessarily fully convinced that you're the right people to do business with. So I was a beneficiary of a lot of advice, a lot of mentoring, and so I enjoy mentoring myself today whenever I can with students at Brown or RISD.
So I'm looking at, in thinking about the story that you've told about your career, and this is what fascinated me in talking with you, but Stephen Mooney made a comment in the chat, and Stephen, you can certainly unmute yourself if you want to and add to this, but what Stephen said was you can't teach desire and love for your craft, which you always had. And so, and in listening to your story, you've taken every single thing you've done and really wrapped it into this career, even if it was being fascinated with bugs or you know, you studied international relations, obviously you're using that. So Stephen, I don't know if you want to add to that, but that's what I think really inspires me about listening to you, is this just unbelievable desire, passion, and love for what you do.
Yeah, it's really, Michelle, I'll just take a second. It's really something that can set you apart, I think, and has always set Don apart. You, as you stated very clearly, you can hear that in his voice, right? You can hear how passionate he is about technology, and it was a love since he was a young boy. I think he made the perfect decision for himself to leave law and pursue technology, and really that's all he needed was that. So Don then followed that up a little while ago with find something that you love, something that will always challenge you, and I think that is very sage advice for anyone.
And you've talked about, Don, you've talked about mentoring, and I was, you know, I've known about you as Don Stanford from IGT, and also being connected to Year Up because you're on the Year Up board, and I'm connected to Year Up, but I didn't know that you were one of the founders of Times2 Academy. And so you're taking this career that you have, which has been successful for you, but you've given back to other people as well. So it's never been, you know, you enjoying all this for yourself or enjoying this success. I mean, even in the legend that you are at IGT, you're always giving back. And so can you explain a little bit about, you know, why is that maybe? What motivates you in that? And then what does that do for you?
Well, I have to say that everyone that I have had the opportunity or the pleasure to mentor, both at IGT in my work there, at Year Up, or just people, you know, youngsters or people who I've met outside of either of those pursuits, I usually come away from that experience learning as much as I imparted in knowledge, because dealing with a younger generation of doers and thinkers this is a two-way exchange, and so I may have some experience that I can impart upon them to help them on their journey, but I learn a lot from them at the same time. And so to me, it's not just about giving. I get to receive also as part of being a mentor. Some of the students that I've mentored at Times2 or at Year Up, I've learned tremendous things from, and you know, other life lessons, listening to their experience and looking at what they're traveling through to try and be successful. So to me, it's also a little bit of paying forward, right? I got to where I was as the result of having great mentors my entire life, and so I'm very passionate about the value of mentorship in general for someone who wants it and seeks it out. And being a mentor is not being a know-it-all. It's basically involved getting into, you know, deep discussions, sometimes both personal as well as professional, to help, you know, at least provide some options to the person you're working with, so that they can make the right decision based on their passion and their, you know, and their career desire. So to me, it's a two-way street, and when you mentor, you receive as much as you give usually.
So as I think about that electricity story, the National Grid or whatever, who the guy was that came there, and I think about that story, and I think about that as a metaphor for today. and what we're doing and what we're dealing with. And this pandemic has really blindsided all of us, and has been tough for us. And in thinking about your leadership, so yes, you were the 8th person, I guess, at IGT or GTECH, but you were obviously a big piece of the success of this company, and the leadership that goes into that. And is there any advice that you can give, or anything you can do to inspire about how to weather the storm during these times? Because this is something we haven't seen before. So, you know, if you had to give yourself advice during this time, or give others advice, what would it be?
Yeah. Well, the people who are on the call, I think, would agree that I'm kind of if you think of the two types of people, the glass is half empty or the glass is half full. So I definitely fall into the glass is half full category. I'm always the optimist who tries to find the good in whatever the situation is at any given point in time. And I can tell you the GTECH IGT journey over 40 years was not all wine and roses. There were some significant challenges along the way, both technologically, organizationally, sometimes legally, and the company persevered through the guidance of many people there, through all of those turbulent times, as well as the great times. And it did it because of perseverance and belief in the overall mission that we were trying to achieve, and the fact that we had wonderful, wonderful people working at the company who basically sacrificed themselves personally to make sure things happened when they had to happen, when the chips were down or we were backed up against the wall. I remember saying to somebody right before I retired for the second time, I said, GTECH is the perfect example of the expression, you know, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And I think that's fitting, you know, a fitting phrase for the company. So I look at this pandemic and what we're going through now, which is certainly negatively affecting every business practically around the world, including the GTECH IGT business for sure. And I say, well, we basically have to just figure out how to innovate our way out of this mess when the opportunity and as the opportunities present themselves. So adversity like this, strangely enough, also presents some opportunities. The fact that we're having this meeting today on Zoom here with 40 some odd people logged on and having this discussion is a perfect example of that. Because I think that education in general, especially secondary education, which has a business model that is probably unsustainable, given the high costs that it takes to sustain that model. We are now looking at an opportunity to actually change the way in which we provide education to people and give them other options and alternatives to the traditional college experience, which, okay, is becoming increasingly unaffordable. So who knows, just the very fact that this pandemic is forcing us to do things a different way may result in a long-term benefit to us once the actual pandemic itself is over. We will have adjusted as a result of the pandemic, and we will find out potentially that those adjustments will work long-term for us in improving, okay, the experience going forward, and not to mention the cost-benefit equation that is right now, you know, weighing so many students down upon graduation. So to me, it's, you know, you got to just push forward. Don't let the bastards keep you down, and and make it happen. And gather as many people around you who are as like-minded to help make it happen. And everyone's got those challenges both at home now, personally, professionally, and educationally. And so, but again, I think there will be light at the end of the tunnel if we can just persevere and stay focused on the objective.
And getting to know you, Don, it really seems like the pivots and the perseverance are the things that I take away, that I say to myself, if I am going to learn from Don, what are those things? And I feel like those are things that sometimes are born within you, and I certainly have some of those myself. But it's always remembering those things as part of that. I see a couple of comments or questions in the chat. Two of them are kind of related to each other. What I'd like to do is open it up for comments in the chat or questions in the chat at this time, and then I'm going to address those two. One of them is that was regarding mentoring, and Julie, I'll have you unmute in just a second and ask that question. Nicole has also said she feels like giving back is essential to personal growth and fulfillment. It's a learning experience to learn from, and the others coming up, and I think that speaks to what you had said, that in mentoring people, you continue to grow yourself. So Julie, do you want to unmute and ask your question, or speak to that a little bit?
Sure. Thank you so much. This has been so interesting. It's so important to hear how people's life stories unfold and result in both personal success, feeling that you've had a successful life, and economic success as well. You mentioned working with people with different personalities early on. I really appreciated that. You talked about your team that helped build your success. One person didn't speak English, one person didn't speak at all, one person wouldn't shut up. That's me.
We love you, Julie.
And someone else said in the chat, that's diversity, right? Like, that's what diversity in the workplace looks like. I wondered if you could speak a little bit. I think the role of mentoring is really important, but in my life, it hasn't necessarily been about these like deep relationships with mentors that other people speak about, but it has been about just building a really broad, maybe more shallow network. And I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about the people you've worked with that have more introverted personalities, and maybe how mentoring might look different for them. I think some people are really fearful of this concept of mentoring being so critical to their career, because it might not be as easy for them to build those deep relationships. And I don't know if you've worked with people who have built maybe more networks, let's say, just what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, so there are different levels, as you just pointed out, of your involvement with people. So in some cases, I've had the opportunity to mentor individuals who came to me, who were somehow, I crossed my path, who really had really important objectives in their life and needed or wanted to express those to someone, and wanted some guidance, on how they should potentially proceed and try and move forward. And then you've got also these broad relationships. I mean, we had over 1,000 people in technology in the company by the time it matured, and I knew several hundred of them personally. And so you also have that big network effect, where effectively you're not deeply involved in mentoring any particular individual, but you're effectively trying to provide some sort of leadership and guidance for a large number of people who are all focused on a certain broad objective. And so there's that balance between the one-on-one kind of deep mentoring, as well as kind of just setting expectations and setting some sort of vision for a larger organization, and then trying to help people understand why that vision is important, and very importantly, what their role can be in making it happen. So there are lots of levels of this. I've had some really deep relationships with students from year up who were, trying to effectively pursue their very first step into a career. And then I've had, more casual relationships with people over the years where I just had the opportunity to learn something from them and impart something to them at the same time. So it's kind of, it's not one size fits all. And you can be mentoring dozens of people, at the same time without even knowing it, if you have the right kind of open relationship with the people that you're working with and the organization that you're trying to build. So I always had an open door policy. I basically always said anyone who had any concern about anything was free to show up unannounced, okay, and confront me and talk to me about whatever was on their mind. And so many times I found myself fielding questions and issues from people completely out of the blue with no preparation whatsoever. And that keeps you on your toes, for sure. But I think you have to have a set of style in terms of how you interact with people and make sure people know that you are available at any time to talk to anybody about anything that they think is important or affecting their ability to work productively in the organization, or if they see something that they think is just going terribly wrong, that needs to be brought to someone's attention. So it's a mixed bag of things, and you kind of take those opportunities as they come.
Don, I think thanks, Julie. Sorry about that. I didn't mean to cut you off. I think your genuineness and your openness is your leadership. And that's why so many people will follow your lead. And so many people are inspired by the work that you've done in so many sectors. So I would open it up to anybody who has a question or a comment at this point. You can unmute or type in the chat. Is there anything that anybody wants to, if there was advice that you'd want for your career, is there anything that anybody would want to ask Don at this point? We've got a few minutes left before we turn it over to Dennis. So now is your opportunity. You've got a major, executive in Rhode Island, someone who has inspired the state, inspired a company, but also inspires people in the state. So I see a question.
By the way, I'm open after this meeting to receiving anything from any of you at any time that you want to follow up on with me if necessary. So I extend that invitation to everyone on this call.
That's wonderful.
Now that I'm a newly minted faculty member of the university.
Excellent. See, that's what happens when you work with Dennis. I can't see the full name, but someone in the comments wrote, Don, looking back at your early childhood in a small island, what advice can you give a person like myself who's interested in giving a voice to young individuals in a third world country who have a similar curiosity in science and a STEM and lack of access? What's the best way to take modern engineering to the youth of the third world countries? Wow, that's a big question. And whoever wrote that, if you want to just maybe ask that a little better than I did, you're welcome to.
Hi, Don. Thank you very much. My name is Willissa Bull, and I'm a student at College Unbound, and I should be graduating this year. I am exiting, and it's been a pleasure just being in this environment. And I'm originally from Liberia. And growing up, I remember one thing that really stood out with me were kids who would take the wire hangers and make little cars, or use the tomato cans to make tires. And it was just so awesome that kids could just be so inventive. But I also know that there wasn't really any step going forward. They just did it as kids and then grew up, found something to do if they could find a job. So coming from a small island, my question is, what advice would you give someone like me, who's very passionate about going back home to help my country, to develop the minds of young scientists that are wasted? They're just wasted.
Well, that's a pretty big order. But the good news is there are organizations, and in fact, there is one located right here in Rhode Island mm-hmm. called ESAP that does just that. They basically provide they provide training to local resources in Ghana, in this particular case, mm-hmm. to train the teachers and provide the teachers with the tools necessary to basically further the education of children in Ghana, in the school systems there, in the rural school systems. Mm-hmm. So, for instance, every student has a computer based on a Raspberry Pi, which is a $35 computer. Mm-hmm. They provide hundreds and hundreds of software programs, open source, so that students can basically learn online, even without an internet connection.
Mm.
And so basically what I could do is I could connect you to some of those organizations, and you could look at what they do in some of the sub-Saharan continent, and you could actually adapt some of that, for instance, in Liberia. So I can connect with you later on and tell you all about that.
Don,
Thank you very
we have a
much.
question regarding that ESAP. Do you know what that stands for?
Yes, Global Sustainability Aid Project.
Okay, the GSAP, okay.
I'm on the board of that organization. It was founded by a professor at Providence College, Steve Mecca, who is unfortunately now deceased, but it is an organization that has survived his departure.
So we only have, I think we have time for
Thank you
1
very
minute.
much.
Oh, thank you. 1 minute question and answer, because we're coming to the close and I like to end on time, certainly. Tim is asking, it's often said that work on the business as well as working in the business is working on the businesses as well as working in the business. How do you balance the time to give back as well as family? And I know you mentioned taking some steps in your career regarding your family, but how do you manage that? It's another big.
Well, I have, I'm a lot less busy now than I was during the heyday of the growth of GTECH. I mean, in those days, I was on an airplane, half of my life, traveling around the world, trying to grow the business and do the business. So what I do now is almost like being on vacation. So although I'm involved in teaching at Brown in different programs and involved in entrepreneurship, mentoring, and several organizations, several nonprofits, to be quite frank with you, I'm totally stress-free, and compared to the life I used to have. My wife does say if someone calls you and asks you to do another thing, it's okay to say no, but I don't say no very often. And so when Dennis called me up and asked me to do this, I said, of course. And in fact, I'm really glad I'm doing it and meeting a bunch of new people. By the way, I want to give a shout out to my buddy Ed Gilbert there, someone who has been around GTECH probably almost as long as I have. I see his name up there. Eddie, how you doing?
Very well, thanks, Don.
All right, the Gilbert brothers.
Very well.
Okay. So
It is a pleasure to work with.
yeah.
Hey, Don, I do have one question, since how you brought me up a little bit here. In starting out with GTECH back in the day, I know personally yourself and Melchester Reeves were certainly inspirations to me. How would you say is a good way to foster that mentorship or that leadership that you guys showed me by example?
Well, you just got to go out and, press the flesh and talk to people. I mean, I never went to management school. I never, I don't have an MBA. I learned to, I heard this expression, or I read it somewhere years ago. I used to manage by walking around. Management by walking around and talking to people, asking them what they were working on and engaging them and finding out their story. Not only is it applied to their work, but also about their personal life. So I think that effectively you just, you go out and walk around and take someone who looks like they're, highly motivated and find out how you can help them go where they want to go. Teach them things that may not become apparent to them. As the company grows and as more people come into the company from different places, I think one of the big challenges for any organization is imbuing them with the culture that helped the company get to where it was. And that's very, very difficult as a company grows, is to kind of maintain some of the cultural attributes that made the company get to its current level of success. And so people like you who know what that culture was and in fact benefited from it have the obligation, I think, and the opportunity to pass that on to other people as they come into the company, so they have an appreciation for what really happened that made the company successful, and now, provides the employment opportunity to that person. Why am I here? How did I get here? And how did this organization evolve from 8 or 9 people to this organization that's now 12,000 people operating in 70 or 80 countries? But so someone like you has a lot of that knowledge, which isn't written down anywhere, but it should be passed on.
Thank you.
So we thank you, Ed. We are at 11 o'clock, which means we're on the hour. But I want to wrap this up with a quote from Jay Buckley, which I think really speaks to everything you've talked about. And Jay, do you want to say it, or do you want me to say it? But I think it's pretty powerful what you've said.
It keeps on disappearing.
I have it up.
Okay, why don't you go ahead?
Don was never a sole contributor. He always put together a team and inspired the team to achieve the impossible. His can-do aura led teams to achieve more than the sum of its parts and always gave full credit to the team. That's how you lead. So that for me is, in the time that I've gotten to know Don and in listening to today, that for me is pretty much the summary of Don Stanford. Would you agree, Jay?
Yes.
Okay.
Absolutely.
I have one other thing I'll say, and another life lesson that I learned. Never ask anybody to do anything that you're not willing to do yourself.
I agree with that. All right, Dennis, will you close us out
Yep.
for today? I know people are probably getting to 11 o'clock meetings. So we've had some people drop off, but just really quick, we'll wrap it up and why we're here.
All right, so thank you, Don. And thank you for accepting teaching at College Unbound without telling your wife. We appreciate that. And everything you said just followed a lot of what we think about, why we set up College Unbound. Find that interest, find that passion, persevere, and our student Willie B, who called in, is exemplary of that. So I thank you. So in 2 weeks, we have Navin Salem, the founder of Adicia. And I don't know if you know Adicia, it's an international company that she started. And it's really about, she created food to help solve one of the biggest health problems in our world, malnutrition. And right here in Little Rhodey is where she is and influencing the whole world. So that's going to be very exciting on May 28th. That's on a Thursday. We vary the days. So, and don't forget to sign up for a free course with College Unbound. Just go to our website. And the last thing, I'll read 2 quotes by 2 of our College Unbound students. One is when we asked them how they used to be and what they are now. One said, I used to be a hummingbird, and now I'm an owl. Okay, so she used to flit around, not sure where she was going, and now she's really a learner and wise. And then this other student said, I started out being angry. So without Gronkowski here, I took a deflated New England football and he said, I used to be angry, and now I'm a scholar. So see you May 28th. Thanks, Don. Sign up for a free course. Love.
Don, this was beautiful. Thank you so much.